On Christmas Eve, 1667, Samuel Pepys, diarist, naval administrator, and womanizer, crowded into the Queen's Chapel in St. James's Palace to hear Mass. He stayed from 9 p.m. until 2 a.m., and he regretted not having brought a pillow to kneel on. In fact, he regretted he'd gone at all, since there wasn't much to see other than the king's mistress, Lady Castlemaine, looking prettily in her nightclothes, as he recorded. Afterwards, he consoled himself at the Rose Tavern with a glass of burnt wine. Pepys's Christmas Eve burnt wine might have been a simple glass of brandy, a popular drink that was imported on a large scale into 17th century England. Or it could have been a warmed, sweetened version, also very popular and much consumed by Pepys. And on the slide, you can see a comment about burnt wine that is boiled with sugar, which is very good, especially for old, weak people. Today, burnt or mulled wine is a familiar Christmas drink, and I'm going to use this short recording to tell you a little about the history of mulled wine, and also to introduce some other sweetened, spiced, alcoholic Christmas drinks that you might consider alongside mulled wine. Spiced wines have a long history in Europe. A Roman cookery book from the 1st century AD includes a recipe for excellent spiced wine, which combines heated wine with saffron, honey, and other spices. Here you can see a transcription of the recipe and also a 9th century manuscript version of one of these spiced wines. If you add additional honey, this produces a beverage that was said to be especially suitable for reviving exhausted travelers. So a very, very sweet mulled wine, particularly good for tired travelers. Again, something you might bear in mind if people are visiting you after a long journey. You can offer them a very sweet Roman mulled wine. The earliest medieval cookbooks also include recipes for aromatic spiced wines, which are sometimes called pimens, from the Latin word pigmentum, which meant spice as well as pigment or color. These drinks were consumed for a variety of reasons beyond the simple pleasures of the palate. Warmed, spiced white wine was said to control excessive menstruation. And a character in Chaucer's Merchant's Tale consumes hippocras, or spiced wine, to increase in his courage, or libido. The term hippocras, the drink that the character in Chaucer is consuming to increase in his courage, probably references Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician who gave his name to medicine's Hippocratic oath. Not that he himself ever prescribed or indeed mentioned spiced wines, to my knowledge. The link between medicine, between Hippocrates and mulled wine, reinforces the appealing idea that these warming beverages offered health benefits. And indeed, they were considered medicinal. For this very reason, mixing the king's mulled wine was one of the specific duties of Henry III's physicians in the 13th century. But back to hippocras. A recipe for it appears in the oldest English cookbook, the wonderfully named Forme of Cury, from around 1390. Cury comes from an old French word for cooking. It sadly does not demonstrate the presence of curries in medieval England. The Forme of Cury was composed by King Richard II's head cook, who was described in the manuscript's title as the best and royalest viander of all Christian kings. And here's a Forme of Cury's recipe for hippocras. You will see it combines 3 ounces of cinnamon, 3 ounces of ginger, 1/4 ounce of galangal, which is another type of ginger, cloves, nutmeg, marjoram, cardamom, etc., which is then reduced to a powder that is used to season a wine. It's interesting to note that this recipe for hippocras, unlike most of the other recipes in the manuscript, contains quite precise measurements for the spices, even if rather unhelpfully it does not indicate the quantity of wine that this powder will season. It's interesting because in general, European recipes did not begin to include precise measurements on a significant scale until the 18th century. Prior to that, and this is what we see here in this example from the form of curry, spices were among the very few culinary ingredients that were measured with such precision because of their high cost and because they would have been measured precisely at the point of purchase. So we can see something about the changing nature of recipes actually in this example, but that's by the by. How did these mulled wines taste? Although the recipes varied, hippocras and other mulled wines were seasoned with all sorts of aromatics, including the cinnamons, nutmegs, and cloves familiar to us from today's mulled wines, as well as less familiar ones such as juniper berries and fennel, or indeed the marjoram in the form of curry. John Knott's 1723 cookbook included 2 recipes, one for red hippocras and one for white. The red hippocras contains, as you can see, not only a gallon of claret and a pint of brandy, but also a quarter of a pint of milk. German glühweins and Scandinavian glügs offered further variations on the theme, alongside France's Van Scholl, Portuguese Vinho Quente, etc. And speaking from personal experience, I would like to add a health warning that glüg is to be treated with the utmost respect. Sweetness came first from honey, and then, after the transatlantic slave trade made sugar dangerously affordable in Europe, from slave-produced sugar from the West Indies and Brazil. You can notice here Knott's 2 pounds of sugar in his recipe. So like so much of European culture, our mulled wines are thus part of the history of European colonialism, even if their origins lie in more ancient times. And in the picture, you'll see a punch bowl and conviviality of a sort occurring around the punch bowl, containing some sort, perhaps, of warmed beverage. By the 19th century, sweetened, warm blends of spices and wine had become an expected component of the British Christmas season. Scrooge and Bob Cratchit share a bowl of smoking bishop, one variant on mulled wine, in the happy conclusion of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Here in the illustration, you can see the 2 of them sharing their Christmas bowl of smoking bishop and a picture of smoking bishop. Smoking bishop is a mulled wine whose signature ingredients are, in addition to wine and some port, some roasted citrus fruit, which is what makes it a smoking bishop, that you have some roasted and charred oranges, for example, in a smoking bishop. A recipe from 1869 explains how to make it, and you can see here this recipe for how to make a good bishop that involves wine, claret, etc., all blended together. And you've taken, in this case, a lemon full of cloves and roasted before the fire until it becomes a rich, dark brown. Keep it hot, instructs the author, William Tarrington, and you will find this is a really good bishop. If you add some roasted Seville oranges rather than the lemon, you get a variant called a pope. With cardamom, white wine, and roasted clementines, it becomes a cardinal. You can see a whole theme here. So there's another beverage you might consider, and I can vouch for its excellence, having had it prepared by actually another member of the arts faculty at previous Christmases. Mrs. Beaton's encyclopedic recipe collection offers a prototype recipe for mulled wine, even as she notes that it is, as she puts it, very difficult to give the exact proportions for the wine, the sugar, and the spices, since what might suit one person, she writes, would be to another quite distasteful. If you're undeterred by her warnings about producing a distasteful mulled wine, and if you would like some exact proportions, you could do a lot worse than Felicity Cloak's recipe for perfect mulled wine from 2010. Here you can see it on the slide. That's also a very nice mulled wine. Interestingly, Cloke is dismissive of the form of Cury's hippocras, which he tries and condemns as tasting, quote, like something that might have been used to ward off the plague. So here are two warm wine-based beverages for your holiday drinking pleasure: mulled wine and a bishop, or indeed a pope or a cardinal. But wine isn't the only tipple you can mull or burn. Alongside these heated wines are a host of other pleasant spiced alcohols associated with Christmas. One 16th century English ballad reminds us of another candidate. The ballad celebrates the Christmas pleasures of cake, warm fires, and hot brown ale. Though I see on the slide here I've put another variant of this verse, which refers to not hot brown ale, but nut brown ale. But there are many examples from early modern England of the consumption of punches, Christmas punches made with warm brown ale. In 18th century Yorkshire, for instance, it was a custom, particularly around Leeds, to invite friends and relatives to visit on Twelfth Night to play cards and share a meal, followed by mince pies, spice cake, and a bowl of lamb's wool. What is lamb's wool? Lamb's wool is a punch, a warm punch consisting of warm ale, small roasted apples, nutmeg, and sugar. I think it sounds rather good. And you can see the similarities in a way between lamb's wool and a bishop, in that they both contain roasted fruit of one sort or another. Guests would spoon themselves an apple out of the bowl and then toast the health of the company, wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. This is a form of wassailing, in fact. So you might consider some lamb's wool as an alternative to mulled wine. For another warming and seasonal alternative to mulled wine, you might finally consider burnt sherry. Warmed or burnt sherry has been drunk in these isles for centuries. The Mermaid Tavern in Oxford was serving it in the 1630s, and it was enjoyed by everyone, from gentlemen to the women of Newgate Market, who reportedly drank it first thing in the morning. In Dickens's 1865, Our Mutual Friend, two bored young barristers while away some hours at the Six Jolly Fellowship Porters over a jug of burnt sherry. To prepare it a la Dickens, you'll need to heat some sherry over a fire until it begins to steam. Warm your glass over the steam. Pour in your heated or burnt sherry with a flourish and savor its rich, syrupy depth. You can fancy it up with some sugar if you wish, but a simple glass of warm Bristol cream sherry is a consoling and comforting drink to enjoy with a mince pie. And heaven knows we all need a bit of consolation these days after everything we've been through in the past 12 months. Cheers.